This video is part of Nickel J's journal on building a mountain cabin. Hi, I'm Nick at my cabin building project in the central Idaho mountains. In this video, I'll turn a pile of 1x12 boards into tongue and grooved planks. In the last video, I used a circular saw to true the edges of these 1x12 planks. Now I'll run a router along the edges to turn them into tongue and groove. Then probably in a subsequent video, I'll put them up on the ceiling. The ceiling was constructed with SIP panels, structural insulated panels, and I'm covering those panels with these tongue and groove planks. I've got half the ceiling done, and the goal is to make the second half look like the first half. With each cutting project, I true my cutting bench. I just leave these nails in place so that it's quick. Run a string out, stretch it taut. I put these adjustment blocks in here. You can see how I can move the string back and forth. I use a bump or no bump technique where I slide the board up and down the fence, and if it bumps the string, it's too tight. If there's slack, it's too loose. I do this because I can see the string move when it's too tight, or I can see the gap when it's too wide. I want it to look like the block is touching the string, but not bump it. If I bump it, it's obvious the string moves on me and vibrates. So I go down the bench and look for trouble spots. I'm seeing too much space at this end. The string's not touching the block. Looks like there's a 32nd of an inch gap there. I'll need to take care of that. This end I'll be able to fix with just by putting another shim back here. I'll back this screw out, put another shim back here, tighten it up and see how it looks. That's better. I'm pretty fussy about this fence being straight because all the straight edges that I use to guide my skill saw and router are shoved up against it. They're, well, here's some of them. depending on what thickness of work I'm working with. You know, it might be a 1x6 or a 1x12. I use different shims or spacers, probably a better word, to set here to run my saw or router down. And these guys on their own are flexible. They're not straight edges, they're just spacers. And I shove them up against this and clamp, and that keeps everything in place while I cut it. The heart of this system is this fence here. If it's not true, none of my work is going to be true. The router bits that I'm using came as a matched set, so there's very little that I have to worry about other than the setback. That's the distance from the edge of the board in, and the depth. And these bits make that real easy. I key on the outside edge of the joint. That's going to be the tongue. When we're cutting the tongue, the outside edge of the tongue is the outside edge of my board. When I'm cutting the groove, it's just the edge of the board and the edge of the board. That makes the setback real easy. And with these bits being a matched set, it's the same for both sides of the board. The router setback is the same for both sides. I have the benefit of very straight boards. In the last video, I showed you how I cut these edges real straight. So I'm not interested in plowing out any more wood with my router and my bits than I have to. All I'm interested in cutting out is this notch. I don't want to cut this if I don't have to. I want to just make contact here, just barely. And on this cut, I don't want to plow this out any more than I have to. All I'm interested in cutting is this notch here and here. So this and the outside edge of the board, I'm hoping will just stay right where they're at. Here's one of the spacers that I came up with when I was doing this side of the ceiling. I cut these long parallel strips with the table saw. It does a great job of cutting things parallel. You just keep boards up against the fence, and it's easy to rip boards into strips like this. So you can see I marked it, keeper for the router setback. I was using these same bits, so I'm hoping this is still going to work for me. So this is my work. This is the board I'm going to cut. This is the spacer, and this is the board that I'll slide the router down. I glued a strip of aluminum angle to one edge to make for a low friction surface here to slide my router down. So I'm hoping that when I snug this and my work up to the fence and clamp, this is my router setback. But I'm not even going to fuss with a tape measure or a ruler. I'm just going to give it a try. I've got a bad end on this board anyway. I'll show you. You can see I've got some void here. I think that's where a forklift hit this board. So I'm going to do some test cutting down here where I've got to cut the board off anyway. So I'll set this up for my cut. I'll go ahead and do that now. Actually, I should say I'm setting this up for my route, not my cut. I don't think it makes any difference which side I start with. So I'll start with the tongue cutter. I like to slide it all the way down and lift it just a little bit so it's not bottomed out, because they get stuck and they're easier to get out if you can loosen the collar and give the bit a tap right here. That breaks loose the part that's stuck, and then you can slide them out. And this router, the depth of cut is adjusted by loosening this bolt. There's a cut in the housing here. Loosen that, and then the fence rotates up and down. And for my depth, I just use a piece of wood that I've already cut and I like the depth of. And I just slide the fence up or down until I get the piece of wood in there where it belongs. Slides back and forth, and I tighten this up. Looks about right. And then as I'm working, I'm always checking my depth, because the router vibrates, things loosen up and move. So I'm always keeping an eye on it. I'm always keeping an eye both on the back set and the depth. I think I'm about ready to cut here. That's just about what I want. You can see this edge, it's barely touched. It's just changed color a little bit on this very outside edge. And that's just what I want. I don't want to have to push this router and my sharp bits through any more material than I have to. I've got the advantage of this nice, clean, straight edge, so I'm going to use it. That's going to stay the edge of my tongue, and all I'm cutting out is this shoulder here and here. And that looks fine. Let me get my scrap and see how it goes together. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that. So I'm just going to go with this setup. As you look down on a router, the bit spins this way, clockwise. So it may seem counterintuitive that I'm moving this direction, because the bit's actually clawing this way and you'd think you'd want to splinter the wood that direction. The bit would rather run this way. It's actually easier to push. But when it gets a bite, it wants to take off on its own. So it's safer to go from left to right instead of vice versa. I'm going to put my dust mask on now that I'm going to start production cutting.
You can see that I'm getting a nice clean cut. There's hardly any tear out here, just a couple of hairs sticking out. Remember, the blade's going around this way, so you expect a little tear out here, but I'm getting hardly nothing. So this is just what I want. I'm taking out very little material. It's very easy to push the router through the wood. The router's not working hard. The bit's not working hard. Nothing's going to be getting hot. This is a good setup. So I'll take this board off the bench, bench another one, and repeat the same thing 50 more times, 49 more times. Then I'll change router bits, start all over, do on the other side. Just routed a tongue into this third board and notice that my tongue is not centered. The first two were perfect, but now you can see how this shoulder, make the light even. Well, it looks to me like this shoulder is not quite as deep as this shoulder. Close. Maybe I'll try one more board and see if I see the same thing. If I do, I'll raise the bit just a little bit. Yeah, I just did another board, and I'm pretty sure this shoulder is a little bit prouder than this shoulder. This is my top side. So I'm going to raise my bit just a little bit here. Unplug this bad boy. And you can see the marks that I've put here, my reference marks. I'm going to erase those as much as I can. Try a wet thumb. There, a little moisture and eraser, and they seem to go away. Okay, I want a just a reference for where I'm at now, and I need to raise the bit, which means it's got to go that way, because my router is turned over when I'm using it. So I need to turn the fence that way so that it goes up. So I'll loosen this. I think part of this issue is I'm just not strong enough to really clamp down on this, or I could blame it on the router design. So I'm just going to move it there about a 1/16 of an inch. Get as tight as I can. I would rather this be a latch locking mechanism than just a thumb bolt. And I'll put a mark for where I'm at, a reference mark. Looks fine from here. Looks good from here. But I'll turn the board up on edge after I've finished and take a better look. Okay, I'm happy with this now. This little shoulder looks the same width as that little shoulder. Good to go. It's funny because it's usually the setback that I have to dial in. My spacer, my keeper, is my lucky stick. It's working out great as far as keeping the router this way. I've been moving along at a pretty good clip through these last 6 or 8 planks. When I feel my router motor and the bit, they're just slightly warmer than lukewarm, just slightly warmer than room temperature. Very little indication of working hard. And I attribute that to removing most of the waste on the edge of the boards with my skill saw rather than the router. I think of it as lightweight routing, just routing the least amount of material possible to get my tongue and groove edges. I suspect this bit set's going to last me through the whole project. I suspect the router's going to last. I think that the wear and tear on them both and me is minimal because of the way the stock was prepared. I went through this material before the routing process with the skill saw and trimmed the edges true so that it was less work to run the router down them. Here's a typical judgment call that a woodworker has to make. Notice where I put this tongue in on this last board. There's a part of the board that's missing right here. I believe a forklift smashed into the edge of the board here, knocked some of the wood out. Very little of the wood is missing lower than the shoulder here. It's just the tongue. So the judgment call is, do you use this board or not? If you're making a tabletop that people are going to be sitting next to and looking at and feeling for maybe generations to come, would you use that tongue? How about if you're going to put the same board 10 to 20 feet up in the air where people will never get close to it, never be able to touch it? That's a judgment call that the woodworker has to make. This board's showing off its pitch pockets. This side too. It's actually kind of pretty. Looks like little crystals after it dries. Actually, I guess it is a gem when it gets real old. But you can see I've let this wood season so the pitch cuts, turns into a yellow powder when I hit it with a saw or a router or a chisel. It's not an issue. But when it's wet, it makes a real mess out of tools. As it is, I haven't had to soak my bits and remove the pitch once on this ceiling project. And you can see that's just what I want. The edge of this board is still right here. All I'm doing is trimming this shoulder and this shoulder. Not plowing any more material out than I have to. It's just enough routing. A youngster, say a 30 or 40-year-old, would set his router to plow out a lot more material. It's harder on the bits, it's harder on the router, and you end up with less tongue and groove. I have worked through the pile of boards that I had on the floor here, cut the tongues on one side. Like you can see the tongued edges there. Whoops, missing one there. Oh, it's over here. Well, that was probably that youngster that came through. Poor guy was only 40, 50 years old. He probably doesn't know how to stack boards yet. So now I've got a pile of tongued lumber. Now my next step will be to cut this groove into the other side of the boards. So I'll probably sweep up, do a little housekeeping, and change the router over to the groove cutter and go to work on this stack. It's incidentally my bit that I cut this side of the boards with is getting hard to push through the lumber. So I'll be able to calculate a linear foot of cut. I'll estimate that I cut half of this side of the ceiling with this new set of bits and all of the other side, and I'll be able to tell you what kind of footage you should expect from these good bits. I'll try to round up the bits, both the old ones that didn't last so well and the new ones that are lasting better, and show them to you. This material stack in its current state shows a good outline of the steps I'm using to make some tongue and groove. Started out with some sticker stacking of kiln dried lumber. The material has a stamp on it that, among other things, includes an HT. I believe that stands for high temperature. And I think that's kiln dried. The kiln dried lumber is stacked with stickers that hold it flat. There's plenty of airspace in between the boards, airspace between the stacks, and the wood seasons here. This kiln dried lumber still has pitch or resin dripping out of it. It drips down on the boards below or drips on the floor. I'm always sweeping it up. Here's some I'll put under the light to show you. It's really kind of pretty. Before it hardens, it's like a thick honey, and if it gets on your hands, it's hard to get off. It's a terrific glue. It takes a solvent to get it off your skin. And it's the same thing with cutting tools. Saw blades, router bits that are going through wet pitch, pick it up when it's dried. That's what I key on for knowing it's ready for my tools, my cutting tools. When I hit the solid resin with a cutting tool, it turns into a white dust. Whereas if I hit it when this is still liquid, it just gums up my blades. I've already flattened, I've already taken all the cupping and twisting out of the boards with the sticker stacking. What I can't do anything about is the crook. The boards will still twist this way in between the stickers. There's nothing to keep this board from coming out this way a little bit. So I trim the edges with my thin kerf circular saw blades, and I did a video on that. I take off just enough to true the edges so they're straight. I don't know if you can see it, but these boards are very straight. And they almost make a wall in themselves. Then I start the routing process. And the routing is to put the tongue in the groove. These just have the tongue in them. In the sides, using as little routing as necessary. So it's dry lumber, not just dry but hard. When the sap or the resin hardens, the wood is actually a little harder. Think of it as being a little more brittle, so it cuts easier than wood that still has the wet sap and resin in it. Truing the materials, because it's easier to push a skill saw through the wood than it is a router, and then routing just as little as possible to get my tongue and groove edges. I'll go ahead and swap bits. I always unplug. I know it's a little more time, and a person may think that because the tool's off, it's safe. But just imagine my off-on switch. It's in the off position now. Just imagine I've got a hold of this bit, and I just adjust the tool on the bench. I just turned it on. Notice I just turned the router on. Okay. And imagine if there's a toggle switch on the side of your router and you bump up against it. The toggle switch is off, but you bump something and you turn it on. If you've got a hold of the bit or your thumb is laying next to it, you're going to get hurt. Seriously. Just unplug the sucker. I better turn this off. These handy end wrenches came with the router. I loosen up the collet and try to, oh, it came out. Usually it doesn't come. And so I'll tap it down a little bit. Remember, I raised it before I tightened the collet. And that breaks the part that's stuck. There, all the way down, up just a little. I find that I've got more grip if I've got my two hands together like that. And then for the depth, I really like just using a piece of wood that I've already cut. This is pretty close to center, and I'll keep an eye on it. Okay, it's hitting the bottom of the bit, actually the top of the bit right there. Hope you can see that. So I will loosen this guy and turn the fence down a little and try it. And I like to play with it a little bit. Yeah, it's looser there. Okay, it's hitting there. Actually, it's picking up the block there on the bit. It's not touching the fence anymore. So I'll go back the other way until the bit starts to bind. Now it doesn't slide, so I'll come back. Right about there. I might eyeball it. Yeah, looks good. So I'll start here and keep an eye on it. So this is my starting point. I don't know if the light's letting you see that or not, but I'm ready to rock and roll. Mark up the edge of my board and see how deep I'm cutting. You can see I'm taking off the carbon of the pencil, but not much more. If we look down this way, can't see much. I can feel it. I can feel the router ended right here. A little bit of a notch. Taking off maybe a 1/64 or 1/24 of an inch. Not a 32nd, not a 64th, whatever half of that is. And that's about what I want. I bobbled the router on this piece. I just tried to change my grip. And you can see here this wow in my groove. Looking this way, it looks nice and uniform. But here it's got a big wide spot where I goofed. Fortunately, this sacred shoulder, this edge, was not cut. If you look down on the board, it's still straight. So I goofed, but I can still use this board. If the router bounces up through the surface, there's an obvious machined circle cut out of it. It makes it hard to use. I'm on the home stretch. You can see my finished piles of tongue and groove planks is growing, and I'm down to my last half dozen boards. Like the tongue cutter, my groove cutter here is getting harder to push through the wood. I'll go ahead and run it through and stop and see how hot it is. Yeah, not too bad. Actually, it's not bad at all. It's warm. When I was in my first 20, 30 boards, I could barely tell any temperature difference. But it's warm now. Certainly not warm enough to burn me. And in this game, heat is the enemy. I'll scrape the sawdust off the cutting edge here. And that's about all I've been doing. So I'm ankle deep in sawdust and knee deep in tongue and groove planks. And that's all the routing that I need to do for now, at least for my ceiling project. I have some numbers I was going to share with you on my ceiling work. I did a little bit of arithmetic so I can show you the primarily how the bits held up. I started out with these guys. They're a brand called Kempston, Kempston, and they lasted for about 1/4 of my entire ceiling project. They lasted for like 9 rows, and then they just were too hard to push through the wood, putting off too much roasted pine scent. They're not in bad shape. I can, just scrape the pitch off with my fingernails. But they lost that fine edge early on. I was disappointed. The next set was these white side bits, and they've held up much better. I can still clean these up, and that's what I'm going to do. They have the cutting edge is just a flat plane. So I'm just going to run a fine diamond stone across there and polish them up a little bit. I've called the factory in North Carolina about having bits sharpened, and they'll do it if they're in good shape.
if they haven't been overheated. But they weren't excited about sharpening these bits that are a match set, because if they have to remove any metal for the sharpening, they're changing the geometry where where the tongue and the groove have to meet each other. So, and I have to pay the shipping. They charge $16 per bit. So I'm probably just going to polish them up myself and label them for light work, tabletops and bookcases and things. So I used 14-foot planks on the ceiling, and it takes 2.5 planks for each row. There's 2 full-length planks, and then you can see butt ends. I alternated the butt ends, that end and this end. So I multiplied 14 times 2.5, and then there's a total of 36 rows, 18 on each side of the ridge beam, for a total of 1,260 linear feet. And since these 14-footers are 12 inches wide, that's also a board foot dimension, if you're interested in that. Okay, for the bits, the Kempson set went for about 1/4 of the project, so I calculated 315 feet. And they were spent here. They wore down much quicker than the white side bits. I mean, they just went down quick. And it shut me down up here. I had to put off the routing until I came back up the next trip. When I was in town, I picked up some of the white side bits. And they finished the job. So I'm giving them credit for 3/4 of the job, 3/4 of the 1,260s, 945 linear feet of routing, both sides of TNG. These bits are still in decent shape. I could easily say they'd go 1,000 feet. I think that if a guy didn't push them too hard and kept them cleaned off, didn't let them get hot, you could probably go beyond that. But I know they'll go this far. So that's my bit on routing boards. I hope you got something out of it. My next step will be to sweep up my mess, and I'll set up a workstation in here, probably just some sturdy planks over a couple of sawhorses, and I'll feed this material up onto that workstation. I'll run a belt sander down them first. No, excuse me. I'll square the ends first. I'll run a belt sander down them, then a random orbital sander. I don't plan on spending a lot of time sanding, but I'll knock the glaze that's on the outside of them so that the oil can soak in. And then I run just a small hand plane down all 4 edges. It's just a micro bevel. I go down all 4 edges. And that's so that if they do shrink, they don't leave that sharp machined edge in between the boards. There's that bevel to add a little buffer so that visually it doesn't draw attention to itself so much. I haven't had any movement on this material, and I put this up here just before last winter. So they've gone through the season cycle and haven't showed any signs of movement. They appear to be very stable. It appears that this seasoning in the sticker stacks worked. I think the condition of the lumber is a very important element for manufacturing tongue and groove. So I may pick up when I'm doing the sanding, I don't know, That's not too technical, but at any rate, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.